When scandal in the church is uncovered or exposed or discovered more than any other attribute in our leaders, the church needs courage. Not wisdom, not balance, policies, processes, whatever. We need a leader who can discern the most right thing to do and have the courage to do it. If you have that, deficiencies in all the other things can be overcome.
This is the Wall of Silence podcast, the ACNA 2 story, an account of church abuse and cover-up in the Anglican Church in North America, of things done and left undone, and why we should care about it. This is episode 14, A Tale of Two Lawyers. A disclaimer. If you have a conflict of interest regarding Bishop Ruch's ongoing presentment trial, it is my recommendation that you not listen to this episode until after the trial is completed. This specifically applies to those on the provincial tribunal, the court for the trial of a bishop, or if you are working with the trial in any related capacity. This episode centers around the story of Sam Lacy, one of the authors of the lay-led presentment against Bishop Stewart Ruch, why he chose to help write the presentment, and how his church leadership responded to it. This will be followed by a more conversational second episode where we each share our thoughts on Bishop Ruch and his trial, why church leaders so often choose to stay silent about abuse, and what it means to speak up about painful and contentious issues when everyone around you wishes you would just stay silent. It is now September of 2025, and much has happened in Bishop Ruch's trial, although in some senses, not much that we actually know about. Two prosecutors have resigned, one of them very controversially, claiming the integrity of the court has been compromised. Along with this, the assistant to this prosecutor has released a letter giving her account as to why she also believes the trial is compromised, and offering sharp criticism of Archbishop Steve Wood, his staff, and the members of the court. The Archbishop and one of the court members has released their own responses, asking people in the ACNA to trust them and believe in their integrity, while also saying they're not going to comment on anything specific until the trial is over. In other words, those following Bishop Ruch's trial have witnessed a tumultuous and highly concerning process that perhaps signals there is no way a fair and just trial can be held. Another prosecutor, Thomas Craps, the fourth in total for the trial, has been hired, after the third, Job Sarabov, resigned due to a perceived conflict of interest. The trial, as of the week of August 11th, was to resume, but has now been delayed once again until October 6th, in order to give Thomas Craps adequate time to prepare and review all the trial documents. Along with this, the Anglican Diocese of South Carolina has called for a third-party investigation regarding the actions of the province regarding the trial. It's important to note this is merely a request, and there is no guarantee an actual third-party investigation will take place, not without pressure coming from throughout the ACNA. Although the title of this episode indicates we will be focusing on two particular lawyers, perhaps it would be more accurate to name it A Tale of Many Lawyers, due to the many attorneys involved in the trial at numerous levels. In working with ACNA 2, we seriously considered putting out a recap episode detailing the events of the past months. But ultimately, without the trial transcripts themselves being released, we decided not to at this time, as much of the information we know is in the realm of back-and-forth conjecture or announcements such as those from the province that don't offer us a lot of helpful information. With that in mind, we plan to release an episode or episodes about the trial itself when it is fitting to do so. For those wanting to get caught up on these controversies, various articles are linked in the show notes. Finally, in very briefly recapping what we know about Ruch's trial, I'd like to note, with all the delays and the real possibility of appeals to the trial's verdict, based on my former bishop's request to pause the podcast, The Wall of Silence would still not have released any episodes up till now, in September of 2025, and for at least several months more. As the title of this episode indicates, Sam Lacy is a lawyer. From Minnesota, he attends a former diocese of the Upper Midwest Church, part of a cluster of churches in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. I should make clear right from the start that he is someone who has played a role in my own story, most especially in the struggles I've had with my former bishop, Alberto Morales, my diocese, and the shadowy, unnamed provincial powers of the ACNA. I should also note that I don't exactly know Sam, or at least I didn't, until I announced that my bishop had called for me to indefinitely stop the Wall of Silence podcast. First, by communicating to me through another priest in my former diocese, and then through an official letter onto which former Archbishop Foley Beach and other ACNA bishops were CC'd. It was in that time of stress and disorientation that members in ACNA 2 told me, "You should talk to Sam. He's a great resource, and he'll be really supportive." And so, at some point in June of 2024, I got on the phone and talked with Sam. What's significant is that, from a lawyer's perspective, he gave me essentially the same advice about the Wall of Silence as the second lawyer who plays into the narrative of this episode, the Canon Lawyer for the Diocese of Quincy. Based on Sam's opinion, there was nothing in the Wall of Silence that could get me legitimately sued for libel or defamation. That I, with ACNA 2's help, had done my due diligence in presenting the facts as best we know them. But Sam also listened to me with intent and helped me gain a more calm perspective in what was a scary time for me. His support and encouragement over this past year has been tremendous. When Bishop Morales called a meeting with me a month or so later after he sent his letter, a number of people told me I should have a representative there with me during that meeting. Someone who can be present with me to listen, take notes, and, if necessary, ask clarifying questions on my behalf. This seemed like good wisdom. But who? Who could possibly join me for a meeting like this? It's not as if people regularly attend serious meetings with ordained clergy led by a bishop. I thought of the first priest my bishop had used to reach out to me about stopping the podcast. He's a longtime friend and also a priest in the diocese. Therefore, he knew the people there as well. But unfortunately, he was unavailable. So who else? My wife? I just couldn't make her do that. So it was all a bit too much. In the stress of the moment, I couldn't think of anyone else to ask. I messaged ACNA 2 for advice and insight, and they said, "You should ask Sam. I bet he would do it." I did ask him, and he said yes. Now, of course, being from far away, he would only be there on the phone or on Zoom. Here's how I presented this idea to my bishop on July 8th, a day before our meeting. To quote, "Dear Bishop, I'm emailing to let you know that I decided I wanted to have someone else present in the meeting with me tomorrow, 7/9/24, in order to have another set of eyes and ears to listen to the conversation and ask clarifying questions if necessary. This is mainly due to the serious nature of the meeting, the accusations brought against me, and calling to end the podcast, and the potential for church discipline through a presentment, and that what we'll be discussing is complicated with lots of facts and concepts to keep track of. I have asked an attorney, Sam Lacy, to be there as a witness in an unofficial capacity at this point. I don't envision he will speak that often, but instead mostly listen." End quote. Here is my bishop's response to this request from a few hours later. Quote, "Dear Father Chris, Pax, in other words, peace. Thank you for your email. I wanted to have a fraternal conversation with you and fellow priests of our diocese that are aware of the situation with your podcast. They know you, respect you, and are praying for you. It saddens me that you feel so threatened by the meeting that you feel the need to invite a lawyer. This is a pastoral matter, and I'm sorry, but I will not allow a lawyer to be present in a conversation between you, fellow members of the clergy, and me. At this point, no accusations has been made against you, and you are not under canonical investigation. If we can't have a conversation as members of the clergy, then we can't have a meeting at this point. Praying for you, in Christ Jesus, from the bishop." End quote. I sent Bishop Morales a response back, asking that he try to see the meeting from my perspective, and why it would be important for me to have someone else present for me, saying, quote, "To be honest, There has been a lot about this whole process that has been confusing to me. So in actuality, I wasn't sure of the nature of this meeting. Therefore, I've been thinking about all the possible outcomes, but also how to feel less vulnerable and to find support through someone being a witness for me." End quote. Bishop Morales didn't respond to this email. And then the following day, in the run-up to the meeting, I texted him, trying to confirm whether or not the meeting was actually still on. I received no response to that text, but decided to go at the appointed time anyway, just to see if it was still happening. When I showed up, I saw the meeting was still on, and 2 additional priests were there as well. One of those priests, who I knew about beforehand being present, was the Canon Lawyer for the Diocese of Quincy, there on Zoom. Let's back up a bit. On June 5th of 2024, Bishop Morales sent me his official letter. On June 6th, the day after, this same Canon Lawyer for the diocese gave me a telephone call, to my knowledge of his own volition and conviction. It was a kind and generous conversation where he let me know he had meticulously listened to all of the Wall of Silence episodes released up to that point, and that, as mentioned above, based on his knowledge, there was nothing in the episodes that could be considered problematic. Nothing that would lead, at least, to a civil lawsuit. Now, he didn't call me to go against Bishop Morales. He didn't contradict or push back against anything in Bishop Morales' letter to me. But he seemed to want to reassure me that I wasn't in any real legal danger. He didn't say as much, but I almost sensed, like he thought, or at least hoped, all of this was something we could work through. So, to get back to that July 9th meeting, where this priest and Canon Lawyer was present over Zoom, to my recollection, he said not a single word in my support that day. Not that I was necessarily looking for him to defend me, but he also didn't even have any points to clarify or push back on anything that Bishop Morales said, or any of the other priests said, for that matter. There was not a single, "Yes, Bishop, but have you considered blank?" Or, "You know, Chris, blank is an important point. Bishop, what do you make of that?" Instead, he fell in step with the party line, saying close to nothing, or nothing of any consequence in my aid. Instead, like the other priests, the call was simply for me to fall in line and obey. That all I owed my bishop that day was obedience. The next day, I sent the Canon Lawyer an email, requesting a copy of the recording of our meeting, and asking if he could offer any clarity about the supposed conflict of interest the Wall of Silence presented for those in our diocese who have a role in Bishop Ruch's presentment trial. His response back was, quote, "Regarding the questions you posed in your email, I do not think it's appropriate for me to comment further at this time. I appreciate your understanding. Please know you are in my prayers as you seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit in discerning your path forward. All blessings, his name." End quote. And that was that. Apparently, when it comes to practical function, I was no longer a priest in his diocese, nor was I a fellow brother in Christ. Instead, I was a legal liability, and he treated me accordingly. I once was a younger priest he was friendly to and had tried to offer help. But now, I was a threat to his client of sorts, that is, the bishop. Apart from a few other brief emails, I have not communicated with this priest since. It's telling to me that to them, my status as a legal issue superseded my status as a fellow member of the body of Christ, and as an ordained priest serving in their diocese. The other lawyer in my story, Sam Lacy, treated me differently. Now, to be sure, I'm not lifting Sam up as some kind of saint who acted with utter perfection. No, that would be ridiculous. Instead, Sam's role is noteworthy because of a profoundly simple difference. He was there when I needed him. He's been faithful this past year to me, a guy he doesn't even really know, offering a listening ear, humble friendship, and some professional advice when I need it. This, to me, is one of the more significant realizations I've had through this whole process. That the most fundamental human relationship is friendship. Yes, I have different feelings and different relational dynamics with my wife, my parents, my kids, my coworkers, and my bosses. But at the core of all of those relationships, those people are, or should be, my friends. That's how I end up loving them the best. But when that relational status is lost, a person easily becomes expendable. Perhaps we should always be asking ourselves, am I treating this person as I would a friend? And if we are not, there's a chance we could be dehumanizing them in some way. For instance, I'm decently convinced I'm not treating this canon lawyer from my former diocese like a friend by going public in this way with what happened between us last year. This may not have been a fully Christ-like way to handle the situation between us. With that in mind, if he ever wanted to reach out and have a conversation in order to try and understand each other and get beyond these temporary legal risks and come to some kind of reconciliation, let this be a public record that I am fully open to that. Consider this an invitation. In a tradition like Anglicanism, I believe there is a kind of clerical idolatry present within the culture, where priests and bishops especially see themselves as not just set apart for ministry, but also, because of their ordination, now inherently superior to everyone else. For many, the roots of this are found in what is known as the ontological change of the priesthood during their ordination. Defining this is a conversation for another day, perhaps another podcast entirely. But my observation, whether it be the chicken or the egg, is it creates a definite culture of superiors and inferiors, with the clergy class taking precedence. But another observation, and this one is perhaps more rooted in general American culture, is the church's placement of legal principles, legal status, over biblical ones, especially when it comes to dealing with contentious and litigious matters. In other words, rather than treating people as the scriptures would guide us, we instead treat them according to the law code and whatever puts us at the least risk for litigation. Now on to Sam Lacy's story. There is one important element to his account that needs to be addressed. When Sam and I began to shape his episodes, it soon became clear one of the more significant aspects of his story is how it relates to his own church community. Not just how the presentment itself was written, but also in how his own priest and his priest's wife, who is also a pastor at his church, responded to Sam's call to address the actions of Bishop Ruch. So, not only is Sam offering here his unique perspective as a lawyer, but even more so, he's telling us the story of how difficult it often is to address abuse within a church community. Through his story, you will see how the wall of silence regarding abuse extends in so many directions. However, as I began to edit his story, I became uncomfortable with the fact that he continually names his pastor and his pastor's wife. Again, another pastor at his church. Up to now, the scope of this podcast has been to focus on Mark Rivera, Bishop Ruch, and other leaders in the ACNA. Sam's pastors, though generally public figures, have not been known outside their congregation for having any part in the Ruch trial. Therefore, I didn't feel like it was appropriate to name them or have their actions called out publicly in this way. And thus, I want to acknowledge up front the rather goofy and awkward approach that I've decided to take. Although they're still in the story, their names have been blanked out completely. So, anytime you hear a pause where it would seem a name should or would go, you can know that I've taken that audio out. It's not a perfect solution, but it does serve a purpose. By blanking out their names, they can act as a stand-in for all ACNA clergy, ministers, and leaders. While there are some who have called for accountability, in my observation, so many more have remained completely silent, seeing the issues in the Diocese of the Upper Midwest as someone else's problem. I acknowledge that Sam's pastors, along with the Canon Lawyer of my former diocese, are a mere Google search away, so perhaps blanking out their names won't be all that effective. At the same time, if you are an ACNA priest, deacon, lay pastor, or even bishop, maybe you can read your own story into this and make a note of Sam's frustration. One of your very own parishioners who's boldly trying to address what is happening in your church community. As a lead into his story, here are Sam's thoughts, recorded afterward, as to why he felt led to publicly name his pastors.
My reason for naming my pastors is not to lay the full brunt of Bishop Ruch's accountability at their feet or to vilify them. They've led only one church among many in his diocese, so they are not solely responsible for speaking out against his actions, but they are leaders over a church, our church, and it has grown in large part recently by taking in refugees from other churches with abusive leadership and a lack of accountability. So I don't think it's unfair to ask them to give an account for their reasons for not talking about this to their people or signing the presentments, if they do in fact agree with them. Also, I think we live in an age of ubiquitous church scandal, where both the believing layman and the unbelieving outside observer have been so inured by bumbling leaders that we almost fail to feel or care about it anymore as parishioners. It's almost like we expect scandal to occur and thrive and be neglected in our churches. And in fact, I dedicated an entire footnote to this point in the Presentment. And so we just don't have the time or the energy or the spiritual or emotional capacity anymore to do the job that we thought was our leader's job. And so you can't blame us, I don't think, at least not entirely, for wanting to just enjoy our Sunday service or our children's program without having to peek behind the curtain to see if all is what our leaders say it is. But I think that's the issue here and why naming our leaders is important. Megan and I, another presentment author, we haven't gone around our church broadcasting the presentments and our leaders' unwillingness to talk about it as a community. And I've second-guessed that, whether I should have been more proactive in disseminating the details of what's happening. But we haven't. The few times I have talked to specific members close to our pastors to get their thoughts and ask for their support, their common refrain was, "Hey, if this was a real issue, I'm sure our pastors would have brought it to our attention." And so then I'm in the position of looking like I've overblown something. I've made something out of nothing because for the most part, and rightly so, people trust our pastors implicitly, and so they could never imagine that they would avoid speaking about something that is so weighty. But I think that's the additional layer of scandal that's occurred. The breach of trust from the highest leaders in the ACNA, coupled with a breach from the leaders that we know, those we eat with, we pray with, and we share life with. And I think that just can't happen anymore in our churches. So to not name them would not simply be to anonymize our leaders in the drama. It would anonymize me and the duty that I feel, and the duty our leaders frankly should feel to respond on the record. And I think it also anonymizes the victims. It reduces their story to a problem for human resources. But if this is simply an abstract issue out there in the hierarchical ether of the ACNA, handled only in conference rooms behind closed doors and only spoken about in perfectly manicured emailed announcements, then it's not real, at least not real enough for the average church member to bother with. It's simply an administrative nuisance that's best left to those in purple robes. But that's not real. Abuse and instances where the church has fallen down on its duty to shine a light on it, that is messy and it is hard, and it affects the entire community. And so it should involve the entire community in its response. These are real victims whose lives were changed forever. And the church has this incredible opportunity to image the Christ they sell every week with its response, to say that we are implicated too in this. We grieve with you. We too are outraged. And together with you, we seek justice. And when we don't do that, those who don't bring it into the light, they should be named. Otherwise, a priest or a pastor is only in office. And the victims are too remote, too nameless, too faceless to implicate any of us. The whole thing becomes a pantomime of one-dimensional actors, of victims and villains. But abuse is always more complex, always. And when you attach names to that drama, the whole story is incarnated. And only then might the average parishioner in the pew pause to think, maybe my trust was misplaced. As good as my pastors are, maybe they wouldn't talk to us about this or trust us enough, or even the God that we claim, to have a communal conversation about abuse and trauma and failures and forgiveness and healing. I want to be very clear, my pastors had nothing to do with the abuse that occurred or Bishop Ruch's blunders as a leader. But they also chose not to talk about it, and they left the few of us who did know to fill in the pieces and do the work of pursuing accountability. And that's how abuse thrives. The community is robbed of the opportunity to know about it, to name it, to talk about it, to learn of our interconnectedness in all of it, and pursue justice together. Sunlight is always the best disinfectant. So as I see it, for any church seeking restoration, naming our pastors must be part of that process.
Again, I want to reiterate, Sam truly wanted to name them, and in actuality felt like he was betraying his message by not doing so. That, with me making an editorial decision to withhold their names from the public, Sam felt like he was doing the very thing he is criticizing here. That is, leaving their actions to the realm of anonymity, rather than communal accountability. Sam and I went back and forth a number of times about how to approach this. So with this tension at the forefront and positioned as our foundation, let's hear his story in full. Again, remembering that any time you hear an awkward blank space, that's the place his pastors' names would have gone. A void that can now be filled with your own priests, deacons, and pastors, and all of us church leaders who have stayed silent about church abuse happening in our midst.
Ultimately, for me, what led to it was a mix of probably identifying the present realities at our church with its leaders, but then also taking my own spiritual inventory, capacity, and then ultimately, what I think was a tipping point was just a general level of outrage. I think that's what activates a lot of us to do almost anything in any specific realm, any context. And I think that by the time I finally decided to jump in and say, yes, I'm going to commit to contributing to the presentment, that had already been a process that was ongoing for probably about a year and a half, and feeling like I was hitting my head against the wall with our local priest and his wife. I think I was just confused. Most of the time I was absolutely confused, and most of the time I was incredibly optimistic. I don't think naive. I think later on, that would probably be my review of it, is that I probably was naive to the powers and the influence of maybe Bishop Ruch over our local parish. And you have to remember, in my specific context, we don't just go to a church where we happen to know who the rector or the pastor is. We, in a sense, we always wanted to go to an Anglican. It's in Minneapolis. And we moved back from the East Coast in 2017, and we lived in a specific part of town where we had dedicated ourselves to that community and also wanted to go to church at a local place, and just said, we're going to raise our kids here, be neighbors here, go to church here. But that was elsewhere. But we had always had a crush on Anglicanism, and we had been in at Church of the Cross, Christian Ruch Church, many years before. When we were out east, we went to a church that was virtually Anglican, and when we came home, we had heard about this church plant in South Minneapolis, and we just said, man, we'd really love to go there, but we really want to keep investing in our local community and stay here. But eventually we did. It took a long time for us to get over that. But part of that process for us was, I specifically remember having to go over to our home and us sharing with them, hey, we're really struggling here. We want to be here, but we also want to be with y'all. What do you say? And I think they just really helped us to get there in a way that wasn't trying to be too influential, wasn't trying to twist our arm, wasn't in any way trying to say, hey, come join the good guys. We have really the secret sauce. They've never been that. That is not their leadership. They are kind of everything. I think there's a whole generation of, for lack of a better term, people coming out of mega churches, which is not our story, but people kind of in the evangelical subculture who've gone to a certain kind of church for long enough where you had a very charismatic, popular pastor who just had a silver tongue and got burned one way or the other, or just felt like you were too anonymized over time, that you weren't really part of something that you thought you were. And you just wanted to have a bit more purchase in church on Sunday. And I've told them this, that we are who we are almost in full because of their personality. They have just an incredible way of bringing people to this church to just want to give and want to serve. And they're not trying, he has zero ego. Truly zero ego. He doesn't guard the pulpit. He doesn't think, he's the best thing you've ever heard. He's just trying to serve a meal every Sunday. And he's trying to get you to Christ every Sunday. And we've loved that about them. And so we finally decided to go. I think that was in 2019. And we jumped right in and we did some volunteering in specific capacities and also hosted what we call a table group, which is just a church small group, and just have loved the church. The first time we heard about any of this stuff that takes place in the presentments was roughly July of 2021. And we learned about Mark Rivera. And I think it just came up conversationally. That was kind of a fraught time because I think I also communicated to our church via email that Bishop Ruch was taking a leave of absence. And he even says in that email, he's grateful for this course of action. Most people know this already, but the ACNA is a pretty small denomination. You can fit the entire thing in like the Michigan's football stadium. It is not big. But that's the first inkling of anything that we got that something was awry. And then it became more drip, drip, drip over time. I think the next thing would have been one of the incidents in the presentments was what happened with Josh Moon. Again, this is not someone who we don't know who's like, oh, yeah, we've heard about him. Josh, we had over to our home and he preached at our church, I don't know, at least a couple of times, maybe more. At first with the Mark Rivera stuff, we knew that was terrible. And I'm not stranger to sexual abuse. My mother was sexually abused. I learned that at a very young age. So I'm very conversant in this conversation and what happens. My wife was also victim of sexual assault in college. And so these are things that we've talked about a lot. So on the one hand, you can say, hey, I have a hair trigger for this. So my antenna go off when I hear about this. And almost initially, my knee-jerk reaction is, what is going to be the response? How are we really going to respond to this? And so I think, that radar was going off when I heard about this, but we were at one night randomly, I don't know, hanging out, having dinner, I don't really recall. And they brought up that Josh Moon was being investigated, that there had been some kind of some incident that happened. And we just could not believe it. We didn't know anything about this. And that's the first time that we communicated even that he had heard earlier that both Christian and Bishop Ruch did know about Josh Moon's prior history in the Presbyterian denomination prior to him coming over. So they knew that he had solicited a prostitute. They knew that he had, I believe, testified to that and was found guilty. They knew all that. And yet they knew what disciplinary action had been taken by the Presbyterian Church. And yet, despite that, not only did they kind of greenlight him for pastoral ministry, they gave him the keys to a church. And further, and this is the part that I said immediately, this is wrong, this cannot happen. They told no one. His vestry, his parish council, they didn't tell anyone there. People can disagree at the degree to which someone who has an incident like that in the past, have they been disqualified forever for ministry? I would definitely lean on that side and say yes. That doesn't mean Josh Moon can't be forgiven and hasn't been forgiven. That doesn't mean he can't serve the church in some remarkable capacity, but it just means he's probably not going to be the guy in charge. And if that's the case, if you do want to do that, then I would say, okay, here's the caveat. You got to tell everybody. You can't hide this. Meaning when he plants a church, you tell that his leadership, his parish council, and then that church knows it. And I'm not saying that you have to reiterate every Sunday and work it into every sermon, but that church needs to have a recognition that this is a person who has done this. And one of the reasons is because there's a ton of power in that story. But the power in that story is that it's known. One, it allows that power to be used. But second, it gives the people that you're serving informed consent. It allows them to assess on their own to say, hey, you've told me this. I can make my own determination. Are you a safe person or not? Are you someone I want to spend time under? Can I trust you? And then further, because of the power dynamics involved in leadership within churches, and my goodness, the entire history of the church, but specifically in the last 30 years, the consciousness of the American church and the rampant scandal, my goodness, doesn't everyone know about what's happened in the Southern Baptist Church and the Roman Catholic Church and the Ravi Zacharias ministries and on and on and on? And I actually footnoted this in the presentments. If you're a pastor, you know that our church history, recent church history, is fraught with scandal. So if I'm a leader, if I'm a bishop or anyone, I'm going to say, if in any way, first of all, I wouldn't allow him to be an ordained minister. But if I did, everyone's got to know. It's also in a way, it's similar to like Paul's ministry. Paul was a person who persecuted the Christian church. Everyone knew that though. everyone. The power he had partly was because he was this. In Acts 9, he met Christ and he changed to this. It's not like Paul came up on a town and they're like, hey, who's this really winsome, charismatic Christian preacher? I've never heard of him. It's like, oh my gosh, we knew him. And he was that. And yet he's proclaiming this gospel. And I think, one, they robbed themselves of that opportunity in Josh Moon's story, is they had, I think, a real opportunity to seize on that and say, Christians aren't people that have to hide behind their sin. We can actually broadcast our sin. It's hard. It's tremendously scary. But we can do that because the power doesn't come from us. It's the redemption story that comes as a result of Christ. And they failed to do that. I think they just failed to see that. I mean, so much of this story is people in positions of authority who are almost blind to the urgency around them, blind to what's right in front of them. I will just say this, from that meeting we were tracking. I mean, we were on the same page. They were outraged. It's not like they were tepid and, they were unsure of what to think about it. I mean, I'll say, I won't mention even some of the words that I was like, yes, I mean, that is my priest. That guy is wondering, what the heck? How could this possibly have happened? That was at June or July, I want to say, of 2022. And then I think from there, it became just kind of the slow, steady march of disappointment in their response that was also completely confusing to us. We just didn't understand, based upon the way in which we learned it, the conversation we had with them. Why are they not talking about this? Why is this something that's not an issue for our church? And to speak on that, a lot of the reason that people are coming to our church, and I think generally the ACNA, is we're almost a church that's been planted by all these other churches, in large part Reformed Baptist churches, that have either had scandal or other reasons. They're too populated, they're too big, they're too anonymous. What we've offered them is that we're not just this single solo entity flying by the seat of our pants on Sunday. We are tethered together across the globe every Sunday by the liturgy we say, by the creeds that we recite, by the tradition and the history that we invoke. And we're reading the same gospel passages, all of us. We're saying generally the same types of prayers of the people. It was a way for people, I think, to buy into something that was richer and more textured in their Sunday morning experience than we had experienced before, in terms of like coming up in a non-denominational Reformed background. That appeals in so many ways. I think the liturgy is especially true, where it gives you voice where you don't have voice. And much more eloquent people have talked about this. But there was, at that time, I think there still is, there's only 4 Anglican churches in the state of Minnesota under the ACNA. It was thought and it was talked about that these are our sister churches. We are not just this single church in South Minneapolis. And in fact, Church of the Cross seeded us. People from that church had actually seeded into this church and helped to start it. On the one hand, this is what was kind of told to us and taught to us day in and day out. And it's included in the prayers of the people on Sundays, where we would pray for other sister churches, including our own, but then other churches even outside our denomination. That seemed really special. Josh Moon would come to preach at our church. I don't know how many times. I can recall 2 times at least, but there might have been more. And as soon as this happened, it was like we had never heard as a church about Church of the Resurrection. It's like they ceased to exist. And this is what I asked about. And we had, in our table group, had discussed this, and we thought, hey, that church is hurting right now. Shouldn't we be praying for them? And not just individually, but like as a community. We're a sister church. He's been to, he preaches at our church. So many of the families go from one church to another. These are only separated by, a few miles anyway. So it's not like these are huge churches where you don't know the people there. You know the people there. Why aren't we praying for them? Why aren't we even if it's not in person with people, why aren't we like speaking up and saying, hey, we're going to have a time for us as a church to get together and pray for them specifically? You don't even have to dive into the particulars of what caused the heartache there, but just to pray for them. And that's something I raised with a couple times. One was, I think, in the fall of 2022, after our table group, we were stirred in this way. I said, hey, I'm gonna reach out to see if he'll meet with me and communicate this to him and just kind of see his response. And I had 1000% confidence that, hey, he's gonna respond. So we met at a pub one night. Here's what I said specifically is that people are fatigued with church scandal. And so many of the people that are coming to our church seem to be in exile from other churches because they had themselves gone through some kind of scandal. And I said to him, it's not going to do them well if they hear about something somewhere down the line where we now are doing the same thing that happened to them. We need to talk about this. They're so tired of this. They don't want to come here and get hurt again. This doesn't need to dominate. This doesn't need to come up in a sermon. You could do it when you do announcements. It could be a 2-sentence thing to just say, this has happened. Here's the little that we know. As we learn more, we're happy to communicate that. We certainly can't communicate everything because, a lot of this demands privacy, but we want to be able to communicate enough where people are informed so that they can pray actively and reach out to people that are hurting. But I think at the very least, because we're a sister church and we've always preached that and we've always been united with these churches, why aren't we doing that? I even offered to him, I said, I'll write it out for you. It can be literally 2 sentences. And the other thing is this, because so many people are so fatigued and hurt from other church scandal, it's an opt-in thing. You're not mandating that people learn about this. You make an announcement. You say, for those of you who would like to hear more about this, come Tuesday night, we'll provide a room. So I even said, if you're uncomfortable speaking about it, deputize me and I'm happy to speak about it. And there's Megan, who's on the podcast, she's in the know about this. And we just felt like this is a big deal. I think that's something that I was troubled by is there was almost this lack of an ability to see that, hey, this is a really big deal. You need to be able to triage this. This has got to go to the top of the list and you've got to talk about this. And what I mean by that is not that it should dominate everything, but this should be identified, spoken to, and then provided some kind of resource for the parishioners so that they can stay informed and pray. Of course, with that, there's some measure of risk, of course. Some people will just want to be a busybody and just take over and there could be a gossip mill. Of course, that's a risk. What a great opportunity to just address that, opportunity for growth for all of us to just say, this is how we talk about very difficult things. We are not so fragile that we can't communicate. And my goodness, our Bible is just rocked with scandal over and over and over. And we want to claim that as our story. And yet when it happens in our own backyard, it seemed like what was happening is they were stiff-arming it and wanting to run in the other direction. So after that meeting at the pub, I walked away fully confident that, hey, we've done this. I think he's going to say something. I think I even came back and told our table group, I was like, I bet he says something the next week or two. And that didn't happen. And I think that's when I first started to get angry, not just frustrated, but really angry. Because then it felt like a deliberate act on his part to indifference. Now, I don't think he is indifferent. I think he has very strong feelings about this and continues to have real fears about this. But I think he's opted over time, and certainly in that moment, when presented the opportunity to deal with something head on, I think his tact has been to defer to others, deter even conversations, dissuade people from having those conversations. He has always been, to his credit, and more than willing to meet anyone one-on-one to talk about issues or questions that have to do with this all the time. The problem with that is that, we're a church body. There is a conversation families should have collectively. And sometimes you don't know how you feel or how to think about something until you've heard your brothers and sisters together in a room and you can trade off of kind of what they're talking about this. I'm not talking about gossip. I'm just saying there is almost like this collective conscience that a church can have and an identity that I think we've been robbed of. And also, frankly, how is anyone supposed to know to come to him to talk about this? If it's been so, I would say, who knows what the numbers are, but virtually no one in our church knows about this. Even, we're coming up on the start of the trial, I think in about a week. I would say 90% of the people don't even know. My guess is, and I could be wrong here, would say, well, hey, that's their fault. We've put this in an email. And he has buried this, and it's my word, in an email a few times. And he's even talked about that from the pulpit. He's made an announcement saying, this was back when we were in the diocese, saying, this has happened. He's under investigation, or he's gone on a leave of absence. Trial's coming up. If you want more information, go here and click here. The problem with that is that the resource you're sending him to is a page. You're not sending them to you. Although I think he did say, you have questions, reach out to me. It almost, in the way that he couched the whole thing, he's saying that this is not something that we as a community need to tackle. This is not something that we need to speak of. It's not something we need to pray for even. This is something that if you happen to be interested in, here's more information. There's an FAQ, hit these links and off to the races for you. And that always rubbed me wrong. That always was like, hey, I don't think this is leadership in a moment that we really need strong leadership. We need someone directing us through this rather than kind of navigating us to a hyperlink. There were a few of us now where there was kind of starting to become a groundswell of attention towards this and thinking that we are not talking about this. And what I mean by that is we're not saying that we need to have like a weekly talk about this. We're saying people don't even know about this. Our church was actually just now also launching membership classes. Really wanted to launch that before, but then COVID happened and COVID rocked everything. And so as we were getting through COVID, I think they were just starting to jumpstart their program of how do you become a member at our church? Because we're not that old. I think we're roughly a decade. And so we've been going since 2019. So 6 years, something like that. In around 2022, as they were putting out these membership classes where you could come to, as part of that class, my wife and I both went. We made it very, very clear. If you have any kind of issues at all, come and talk to me. And if along the way it becomes an issue with me, come and talk to your parish council, which is kind of, I think some churches use the term vestry, but basically it's a board of elders. These are people that help make decisions. Come talk to them. I think at this time is because we felt like, hey, we were talking to him. He's not listening. He doesn't seem to kind of get it. So let's go talk to the parish council. We tried to meet with them, and their first answer was no. And again, we were really stunned. We're like, wait, what do you mean? You won't even meet with us? The response that we got was the only reason they would need to meet with us is if we felt like we were needing to remove or discipline him in some way. I didn't understand this. We were all like, what are you talking about? Why would we need that? Why do we want that? We don't want that. We're here because you told us to come to you. We're not trying to, remove him. We thought that you were an additional resource, and especially because you're advising him on this issue and others. So we had some back and forth email conversations with the head of the parish council at the time. And then finally it was agreed that they would meet with us for one night, I want to say for 45 minutes or so. And so those of us who wanted to meet with them, I want to say roughly 10 of us, we divided the time up. We each wrote out a specific kind of thing that we wanted to say. And then we said that. And really the ask at the time was, hey, can we mention Church of the Resurrection? Can we pray for them and prayers of the people? From where I said, it seems absolutely bananas that we even had to make that request. We even had to ask about that. And I'm sure that most churches are bombarded with all kinds of requests, including prayers of the people. I understand that. And you certainly can't say yes to everything. And some things might be hyper political or just, out of left field or whatever that you'd want to say, hey, we're probably not going to mention that. But as a general instinct, I think there should be a default to where if people make a request, we're probably going to pray for that. We don't have to give it all kinds of attention, and maybe we may not use the words that you use to articulate that prayer. But I think prayer overall is just a good thing. So yeah, we're gonna lift that up, and we pray for this church that's hurting. It just seemed odd that was actually the case. And so that would have been fall of 2022, 6 months after Joshua was learned about. The next kind of thing on the list was me meeting with Bishop Ruch, Megan's letter that you've already talked about. So the same day that she met with the bishop, I did too. That didn't go well. And I definitely had an agenda. I wanted to kind of just see him and meet him face to face. I hadn't before. I think I'd heard him preach at Church of the Cross many years ago, but otherwise I'd never met him. So part of it was I felt like I needed to actually meet this man because even though I didn't have a personal grievance against him, I was certainly critiquing his leadership. I will say immediately I walked up to him and the first words out of my mouth were, "You'll have to forgive me if I don't shake your hand." And it wasn't intending to be a bruise or I gotcha. It was just like, I don't think I can. And I think that was, again, like my backstory of a mother that was sexually abused as a child with people around her who said nothing, did nothing, just allow it to go unacknowledged. I couldn't kind of bring myself to do that. In terms of the content of that conversation, I also asked him about the finances. I kind of wanted to figure out if resurrection was a cash cow, because I think there had been murmurings about the possibility of leaving the diocese and what that meant financially. Percolating in my mind was also the idea is, what are the risks if they were ever trying to leave the diocese? Are they hamstrung in any way by, can he keep them from getting a paycheck, kind of a thing? So I did ask him details about that. When I did, he found that very offensive. At least that's my read on him, because he even asked, he said, why are you asking these questions? I don't even know what my response was, except that I don't think it matters, that I want to know. And that was it. I think he did say, well, I think we're about out of time. And that was it. So very uneventful, but I just wanted to kind of meet him eye to eye. The thing after that was in May of 2023, late May is Ascension Sunday. And on Ascension Sunday, we have this big park across from our church. And as part of that, to celebrate that, we go and we fly kites. And I had another talk with that day. And again, I had asked him, can you just say something about this? Josh Moon, can you at least acknowledge that this has happened? Can we address this? And I remember that he invoked the Mars Hill podcast. And he had said something along the lines of, we can't do that. This will be Mars Hill all over again. I was stunned because I don't recall if I said this, but I was starting to think of it. I was like, hey, did you listen to the same podcast I did? Mars Hill fallout was because people didn't hold leaders accountable. They didn't talk about the things that Mark Driscoll was doing to his people. That you had people around him that was just an echo chamber. Like, what are you talking about? If you want Mars Hill to happen, keep following the route you're going. So how did I even get into the idea of contributing to the presentment? Megan Tucker reached out to me, and she's in our table group, our small group. And so we see each other every week. We don't talk about this stuff every week. And in fact, we had at this point, I think, become so tired of it. We didn't want to talk about this anymore. Because again, it seemed like almost futile. It seemed like almost no matter what we did, our leaders weren't going to acknowledge this. They weren't going to talk about it. We had plotted, what are different ways that we could think about this, that I had even felt it incumbent upon me to almost talk to other parishioners individually. What I didn't want to do was in any way, I don't know what I was afraid of, but I didn't want to see as like this subversive unit within a church that's trying to, I would just say, as a general rule, I'm just a quiet guy. I'm an attorney. My job is very busy. I have 4 children, and I just have a lot of work to do. I have a lot of kids I need to attend to, and I want to be very present for them. I don't have a lot of time, like most people, to do things on the side. I think that's why we kept these overtures at our leadership. This is why we kept presenting it to them. Aren't you going to say something? It's because, hey, I don't have time for this. Please do something. This is actually your job. It's not mine. I get it that you don't want it to be your job, but this really kind of falls in with you. Megan reached out to me and said, hey, did you know, according to the Constitution and canons, that there can be a lay-led presentment? And I said, oh, of course I didn't know that, because I don't know anything about canon law, and I'm not that interested. And my first response, at least internally, I didn't communicate to her, was like, there's no way I'm going to do that, just because of time. I was like, I was in private practice, very busy. There's just no way I'm going to do it. And I think some of the things that I've talked about kept stacking up. We kept approaching for their response. We kept being disappointed. And I suppose over time, there's only so many times that can occur before you're like, I can't critique them for their lack of action if I'm also not going to do anything. And I think when Megan presented to me that there was actually an opportunity for parishioners to do something through the proper channels, then I thought, hey, that's meaningfully different. This is not us standing up in church and trying to fuss and holler and say, hey, look over here. These are what they're not telling you. We just didn't want to do that. We didn't feel like that was appropriate. This was a way to pursue what we felt like was the right thing to do, but do it within the structure in which the ACNA had already laid out for us. The longer I think they kept putting it off, the more frustrated and angry we became, until finally I told Megan. And then Megan had at that point introduced me to Audrey and then to Connor. And I just said, yes, I can help. And I believe that was in February 2023. We officially submitted the presentment in 2020 or June 2023. I don't know, 5 months of work with all of us. This is on top of, our full-time jobs, our families. It's having Zoom calls, it's meeting late at night, it's working on things, it's editing each other's work. The role that I played largely, I was the only attorney on the team, which honestly, I don't think that means a lot, because it's not like I know Canon Law and I wasn't trying to be an expert on it anyway. I was just trying to use my experience to say, well, if I were going to draft a kind of ecclesiastical complaint, it would probably look something like this, provide some structure. Also, I think because, at least in my practice, I've had a lot of exposure to the federal rules of evidence. At that point, I didn't realize how much the ACNA judicial body was going to mimic what they see in the federal system. But I had an inkling. I thought if indeed they were going to borrow from that, then I can provide a little bit of guidance there. So it was really just either drafting parts, editing, so the whole thing, reviewing every piece of evidence that we have to say, is this legitimate? Would this pass, federal rules of evidence to get this admitted? I think that's what I did. Who knows how valuable it was? But I do know that we were scrupulous. We tried to button that thing up all the way down. And I think because we learned, although I don't think it was officially told until around the time that we submitted the presentment, that there was another bishop-led presentment. I heard later on that kind of redoubled their effort or galvanized their effort to keep that going, because now that's been made public. But ours is just very different. I mean, I think ours has over 50 hyperlinked exhibits. We bring up incidents that were not talked about or considered at all in the Husch-Blackwell report. We deliberately did not want to rehash what came out in the Husch-Blackwell report, because we felt like if that wasn't jarring enough, even though we felt like it should have been, we wanted to show that there had been a pattern and practice of continuous errors of judgment on the part of Bishop Ruch that says this has not just happened once, this has happened multiple times, and this continually puts people in his own congregation at risk, and then others in the diocese. And so that was our contribution, and that was my part in it. The culmination of it came, I think, at the end when we knew this was done, and we knew after 4.5, 5 months of work, it could still be dead on arrival. And so we put it out because of the canon and constitutions. You had to have one priest outside of our diocese, one priest within, and then I believe at least 8 signatories in addition to that. We knew we could get those within the UMD parishioners, members, to sign on. Interestingly enough, I mentioned before, our membership classes, because of the way in which I think handled this, I refused to become a member. My wife did become a member. And that, I think, is actually kind of the beauty of kind of the way that we think about this. People can think differently about this. And I'm not infuriated at the fact that someone might think differently about this. Is my wife felt like she could still very much support our church and become a member, whereas I said, I don't think I can. It goes to the core of who I am. I don't believe I can be a member yet. And so it was almost like a watch and wait thing to see, I'll jump in, both feet and become a member. But until then, I can't in good conscience say this is something I support. So the first person we sent the presentment to was, I emailed it to him on a Friday night. And I basically said, I wanted you to receive this first. You're not in this, and nor should he have been. But I said, I wanted ultimately to read this, to internalize it. But then I hope that you'll see over time that this is worth you signing off on. And that obviously didn't happen. I mean, there are these other incidents where the 5 of us who were involved were, we had constant meetings. It's almost like we worked as much after we finished the presentments that we did during, and it was more strategic. And like, now that we have this, how do we get the required signatures? Each of us was kind of designated different people to email. And I believe mine at one was all the priests inside the UMD. I recall that email, and obviously I got silence, except I wanted to say for one person. When I sent it out, I included a quote. This is from Dumbledore, and said, "It takes a great deal of courage to stand up to your enemies and a great deal more to stand up to your friends." And I thought that perfectly assessed the situation in front of him. Was we were asking a priest to go on record against, very likely, the bishop that ordained them. Who knows what additional risk there would have been to them after that? I think that's different for each priest. But needless to say, almost no response. June 7th, 2023, Archbishop Foley made public some of the antics that Ruch had been doing or back-channeling behind closed doors as to the presentment and leave of absence and other things. And he made that public in an email. And I recall receiving it that day, reading it, and I immediately texted. And I just said to him, now mind you, this is June of 2023. We found out about Josh Moon a year before, and we had been asking him for, several times throughout that year to at least acknowledge that this has happened, even say that this has happened. That's all we were asking. Right after I texted him, I just said, I'm just going to call him. I called him. He immediately picked up, and I just said, my goodness, after all of this, you see what Bishop Ruch is doing. At least give Megan and I an opportunity to tell our church that this is happening and inform them that Church of the Resurrection, which has gone through all this stuff, is hurting, and allow us an opportunity to pray for them. And his response was initially, and this is a long conversation on the phone, but he said, look, we're not going to give you a room. We're not going to let you do that. And I said, why? I don't understand. I just don't see what the risk is, what the harm is, what the fear is. And I don't know that I recall exactly his words anyway, but I know that they weren't enough to in any way convince me or show me in any way that there was a legitimate response to that. I did say to him, and this actually came to where he wasn't yelling. I was yelling. I came to a point where it got so heated. I got so heated rather that I was yelling at him. And I was saying, what could you possibly be thinking? How could this not be something that is of primal importance to you? And the description he gave of our church, I retorted with, I was like, we are not that fragile. I think if you could see it, we are a resilient people and we don't have hard conversations. And when hard things come up, we as a church do not address them. And I said, I think we're more resilient than you think. I think we can handle it. And frankly, I think our God's a lot bigger than the God that you're letting on.
After my conversation with Sam, he had some more positive reflections about the role his pastors played throughout this process within the Diocese of the Upper Midwest regarding Bishop Ruch's actions, as well as improvements to their own congregation's safeguarding policies. Even so, ambivalence colors his thoughts throughout, as he questions the silence of his leaders, even as they left Ruch's diocese and entered a new one.
I knew that our pastors weren't checked out. I knew that they were involved and had been involved. Our pastor's wife was on the bishop's council, in fact, and she had stepped down even, and I believe even wrote a letter of resignation because she did not feel that the council could adequately address their response to the investigation that took place of Bishop Ruch and his role in the mishandling of the abuse allegations. I think I got that right. But again, part of my inability to even articulate what happened is because nothing was ever being communicated to us as a church, or even the few of us that were pretty interested in this and wondering how things were going. It's we could not get concrete answers to basic questions of what's being said, what's being done to address these issues, who's involved, how will the process play out, is there a timeline? No answers to any of this. And so in the beginning, we could trust. But as time went on, it was well, what reason are you giving us to trust this? So I don't think it was really unfair for us to basically lose our trust. I mean, we also knew that our pastor's wife with a group of others on staff at our church had basically rebuilt our children's safety policies and procedures from the ground up because our diocese had not given them anything. And then certainly in the wake of the terrible Mark Rivera story, they felt like we got to redo this. And they did that. And that was a tremendous effort that took a ton of time. I mean, it was really well done. And I think it did reflect their level of care for our children. There was definitely a trust us ethic at our local church. And even more, a trust the process idea that those above us were especially equipped to handle our questions and our grievances about the abuse that had happened. And it was their role to look into that and to come with decisions. The problem with that over time became, one, it took forever. And it kept going and kept going and it kept going without any answers, without any information about what was the process, what was the timeline of the process, who was involved, What were the parameters of the decisions and how they would come down? And the more and more we asked about this, the more there was kind of like a shrug of the shoulders saying, hey, we don't know, but still continue to trust. And I think for some of us, it was just like, well, I think the days of doing that are long gone. We don't just implicitly trust Christian institutions anymore. Like, you actually have to peel it back and start looking behind it and saying, what's actually happening? And we just kept doing that. And I think just over time, it just created more and more of a rift between myself and the few of us who were involved in the presentments and our own local pastor. It's not like they weren't putting in some effort, and I fully recognize that. They had even said things to the effect of, hey, we're doing what we can, we're saying stuff. And it was always really nebulous. You couldn't quite ever understand what exactly they were saying and to whom and to how and what the process was. It was just like, again, it was just very much, hey, trust us, we're on it. But it was like, well, 3 months have gone by. There's nothing. 6 months, 9 months, a year. It's like, trust what? Like there's nothing to trust here. Nothing is happening. And so I think over time, it just became like, we can't trust you. No one is at the wheel here. And so to the degree we can take this kind of into our own hands, we're just going to do that. We think that that's a good thing. I think the final event that occurred that ultimately propelled me and convinced me to give myself fully to the presentment effort was when we hosted as a church our new bishop, when we had transferred from the Diocese of the Upper Midwest under Bishop Ruch into the Diocese of the Rocky Mountains under Bishop Ken Ross. And so he came, I believe it was 1 January, to meet everyone. And the difficult part of that visit for me, and it was more than difficult, it seemed almost maddening, was that there was no acknowledgement at all about the events that transpired in order for us to transfer out of the Diocese of the Upper Midwest under Bishop Ruch, which our own pastor had dubbed a crisis, into what we were hoping was a much healthier diocese under Bishop Ken Ross. And we just didn't talk about the past. It's almost like we were free to erase it from our minds entirely, that it was just moving on, and we're just happy to be where we were. And I think on the one hand, I don't want us to labor under that forever, but I do think that there's a certain sequence to healing. And part of that is naming the past and at least acknowledging it and saying that this did occupy our time and our thoughts and our hearts. And this is something that hurt us as a community, but now we're hopefully moving on to something much healthier. Again, it just seemed like we were acting as though nothing had happened. And to the degree it did come up, the ways in which we celebrated our new station, we were willing to erase it from our memory.
Sam continues with some final reflections.
Our church does a really good job of talking about social justice issues, which can be taboo in certain churches, and I get that. And they, on the one hand, don't let it dominate, but they also acknowledge it and they recognize it and they give people an outlet to experience that. One of the ways is they do a tour of South Minneapolis, a historical tour of South Minneapolis. And one of the things that they talk about is the redlining that went into the covenants for these homes that were purchased, to where when you purchased a home, written into the language of the mortgage was that you could not lease or sell this to an African American. This would have been the 1950s or earlier. Our church does such a good job of talking about that, addressing it. Again, they're not shoving it down anyone's throat. They're not forcing people to talk about these issues, but they are providing a forum and a space, an outlet, either through book clubs or different gatherings throughout the week for people to talk about these difficult issues. And they do this on a range of issues, mass incarcerations of African Americans. They do such a good job with this. What sticks out to me about all that, it is that if you think about, like, for example, Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, who his target audience there is, he is writing to white sympathetic churches to his cause. He's not writing to his enemies. And he is saying to them, you're on our side, but you keep saying, wait, how much longer should we have to wait before justice can come? How much longer do we have to wait before you are vocal and you stick your neck out with us? I think holding those two things up side by side, it makes no sense to me. The churches that we venerate, that we admire, that we want to probably claim as our legacy, or at least that's the stream that we want to be downriver in, and we want to say, that's us. Those are the Christians we want to be. In the moment that we have that opportunity, I mean, if you think about this, Chris, how many opportunities does any of us ever get where you see something's wrong right in front of you and you say, this is going to hurt, this is scary, this is going to risk a lot, but I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say something. That virtually never happens in almost any of our lives, especially as Americans. We probably think that is the case because we're so politicized in other ways that we think that we're activated into that, but really like an opportunity to really stand right there. When I think about that, I think our church's response seems so empty and facile. And I just thought, we worship these churches. We admire them. We venerate them. And we're nothing like them. In this moment, when our people need us the most to be able to talk about these things, we're silent. After I talked, all as well, and she and I talked, and she even asked, why haven't you become a member? Why have you held out? Why have you? Because this was heated again, and I don't in any way fault. If anyone was heated, I was more heated than them for sure. But I just said, because of this, because if you guys are waffling, you guys are unable to see this what it is. And I think I talked about that before, is throughout this whole thing, Bishop Ruch could not see what was right in front of him. I recall on that conversation saying that right now what we need from you is leadership. The way that you do that is you have to figure out, you have to discern for yourself, and no one can do this for you, is what is the most right thing right now. Figure that out and then do it. It's that simple. Because this is not about Stewart Ruch. We're asking you to hold accountable a man that wears the same clothes that you do. And he serves communion every week to people standing in a serving line, hungry for mercy. And that is one of the most sacred acts that you do every Sunday. He did that. We're asking you to hold him accountable for someone who hurt a little 9-year-old girl. And that's what this is about. Everything else after that is secondary. So the moment when our church or my church characterizes this as like an abstract issue to be solved, like it's either better policies and procedures or it's a different diocesan leadership, all the while never speaking about what happened, riding roughshod really over the true story that underlies all this. When they do that, I think they've lost all credibility. And then along the way, they've lost the ability to do the real work of restoration. So we don't even live up to our own name, and not even close. And I think that there is shame in that. I didn't say all that, but I did say to him, figure out the most right thing to do, because that's what he was saying to me was like, I do recall him saying, Sam, we have divorces happening right now. I have people meeting with me for coffee who are going, addicted to pornography, all these things. And I just said, that's the job. That will never stop. That is literally what you signed up for. There will never be a time when you're doing active ministry that will not be the case. And unfortunately, in addition, right now, you have this. And what you have to do as a leader is you have to be able to triage these things and say, what deserves my attention right now? The kernel of this is they've lost focus. This is about a little 9-year-old girl that was hurt by a guy wearing the same clothes that they wear. And if they can't see that, then it becomes strictly about policies and procedures, safety, standards. Those are real and those need to be addressed, absolutely. But you can't put courage in a policy and procedure. You just can't. And I think that's the one thing that we've lacked from our leaders. More than anything, what we need from our leaders is courage, because policies are not a prophylactic. They're not going to solve future predators. They can help, no doubt about that. And we need to put the strongest measures we can to protect our children, protect each other. But when they don't work, as they won't all the time, in response, what we need from our leaders is courage. When scandal in the church is uncovered or exposed or discovered, more than any other attribute in our leaders, the church needs courage. Not wisdom, not balance, policies, processes, whatever. We need a leader who can discern the most right thing to do and have the courage to do it. If you have that, deficiencies in all the other things can be overcome.
Sam's story will continue in our next episode. If you believe in what the Wall of Silence podcast is trying to accomplish, please consider supporting us through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Wall of Silence podcast. Though I am not able to offer extra material every month, you never know when something might show up. Nonetheless, I appreciate you helping to make this show a reality as we lift up the voices of church abuse survivors. The Wall of Silence podcast is produced and edited by me, Chris Marchand. I also record the music, and our artwork is by Alice Michlik. You can find her other work or commission a piece through her Instagram account, Mouthful of Stars. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or whatever service you listen on. You can find a link to the transcript of this episode, including related articles, in the show notes. Thanks for listening. I hope the conversation continues wherever you find yourself.